Here's a rewritten version of your first scene in simple, engaging, and emotional style, keeping it viral and cinematic. The city of Okirika buzzed with life as the Madu family arrived at the grand restaurant, their laughter mixing with the soft rhythm of high-life music. Golden chandeliers shimmered above, casting warm light on polished tables covered with crisp white cloths. The air smelled of rich jollof rice, roasted plantains, and spices that made mouths water before the first bite. Every family member was dressed to impress, vibrant ankara and delicate lace that caught the light with every movement. They greeted each other with loud smiles and playful teasing, their voices carrying pride and wealth, the kind that seemed to fill the room even before the meal began. Outside, the city streets pulsed with energy, but inside, the Madu family created their own world of elegance, laughter, and quiet competition, each aunt, uncle, and cousin trying to outshine the next. No one noticed the quiet footsteps that would soon change everything, a story waiting to unfold beneath the glittering chandeliers. If you like, I can continue with Scene 2, the humble arrival, keeping the same emotional, cinematic, and viral tone so the story flows naturally. Do you want me to do that next? Here's a rewritten version of Scene 2 in simple, engaging, emotional, and detailed style. Chidinma stepped into the restaurant with quiet confidence, though her heart thumped like a drum in her chest. She wore a simple wrapper, the kind that didn't sparkle or shine, and a neatly tied ghillie that framed her calm, gentle face. The music from the highlife band seemed louder now, echoing in her ears as she tried not to notice the eyes turning toward her. She was part of the Madu family, but everyone knew she had never lived like they did. While her cousins flaunted gold jewelry and embroidered lace, she had always lived modestly, working hard to build her own life. The rich aroma of roasted meats and fried plantains mixed with the soft perfume of expensive cologne from her relatives, and Chidinma felt a familiar pang of invisibility, like she didn't truly belong in their glittering world. A few whispered laughs reached her ears, thin and sharp, cutting through the music. "Look at her," she imagined one of the cousins saying. Still the same plain Chidinma. She held her head high and smiled politely, but inside a storm of hurt brewed. Every step toward the table felt heavier than the last, as if the polished floor itself knew the weight of her family's judgment. Her hands clenched the edges of her wrapper for courage, and she reminded herself that she had always carried her life with dignity, no matter what anyone said. As she moved past the gleaming tables and glittering chandeliers, she noticed the subtle glances, some curious, some mocking, but she refused to let them see her falter. Chidinma had always been underestimated, overlooked, and underestimated again. Tonight, however, there was a quiet strength in her walk, a slow rhythm that spoke of patience, resilience, and a life quietly built on her own terms. Unseen by the family, she carried with her the beginning of a story that would soon change everything, a truth far greater than the laughter or sneers, sir. Sure, la finds the gallery lanation with no wood. If the weed is and that center of Nitsi, there are lopsish. As the first years near thy gill my finite color voting if they are my mere vet. Schnell ash la feet in get your first night your vet. And a scash your fing it sit the whip. Hurry if the one, he'll else will march snay her. Get sure he smith the list sweet for reship. Her thing will march to me, Sir Wolf Shilloff, but her hangish dash day your vet video wouldn't you leave. So her from the dish. Certain if Röchgen ein Milkefer, the Fleimer Hirwach, Turkensen Sachen, Snapsui Miniter Murmsis Hove, Steel Snaked Milksgrove, Hobbiest the Sarkert Absurd File Loch full of Runned, Snemo Murfluff Shaha, but that is so. We yell no muster fun, said I'd swill be Rufsilbest it. Doing it Nikisha if Snake the Suflam Surka, her nurse law, as we must foster things else. Loch brushing ourselves near. We at the amned. Det kapskation er rart a hele leir. First the shale my for knows. He'll laugh me go. Smash the lightning mum sin the damage. Ma great both nyars nester the felicia. Her saf her. The is giver with so much will a good wizard out net. Says I'll go circle crops. Still nerve look flow whale sit as a best. Dahil may there will be natural green shadow specimen. Hoyats life the on shum. Here's a rewritten version of Scene 4 in simple, emotional, engaging, and detailed style. Chidinma's back felt like it was on fire as she walked away from the long dining table. Every eye in the room followed her, some with curiosity, some with amusement, and some with thinly veiled judgment. The polished floor reflected the golden light above, and with every step, she felt the weight of humiliation pressing down on her chest. Her wrapper, though neatly tied, seemed plain and small compared to the vibrant, glittering fabrics worn by her family. The sound of her own footsteps felt loud in the quiet that had fallen over the table, echoing the sting of rejection with each tap. Her heart ached with a mixture of sorrow and anger. She remembered all the times she had been overlooked, all the laughter that had quietly cut deeper than any insult. The aunt's sneer, the cousin's whispers, the chuckle of the uncles. It all replayed in her mind, a bitter song she had known too well. Yet, despite the pain, Chidinma refused to cry. She had learned long ago that tears could be taken as weakness, and tonight she would not give them that satisfaction. Her hands pressed lightly against her sides, gripping the folds of her wrapper as if it could hold her dignity together. Around her, the restaurant seemed to blur. The warm smell of spices, the glow of chandeliers, even the soft high-life music faded into the background, leaving only the rhythm of her steady, determined steps. People whispered, some shaking their heads, others exchanging smirks, but she walked on, letting their judgment roll off her like rain on polished stone. With every step toward the back of the restaurant, Chidinma felt a quiet resolve rising inside her. The humiliation she carried was heavy, but it was not the end. It was only the beginning. The girl they tried to diminish was still standing, still composed, and stronger than they could ever imagine. By the time she reached her seat at the back, her heart. Here's a rewritten version of Scene 5 in simple, emotional, and engaging style, with cinematic detail. Moments after Chidinma settled quietly at the back, a hush fell over the restaurant. The soft clinking of cutlery and the faint hum of conversation suddenly seemed louder, more alive, as if the room itself was waiting. Then, from the far end of the hall, the head waiter appeared, tall and confident, holding a microphone. His polished shoes clicked against the marble floor, and the small crowd of diners instinctively turned toward him. The golden light of the chandeliers reflected off his crisp uniform, lending a certain gravity to the moment. He cleared his throat, and the sound echoed through the restaurant, making everyone pause mid-conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable authority, "before we begin tonight's dinner, we have a very special announcement." Heads turned, whispers began to ripple through the room, and even Chidinma felt a flicker of curiosity. The family at the table straightened, their earlier laughter fading into an uneasy silence. Some of the aunts and cousins exchanged glances, not knowing what was coming, while the uncles leaned forward, sensing that the night might just take an unexpected turn. Chidinma's heart skipped a beat, a strange mix of anticipation and nervousness filling her chest. She had never imagined this kind of moment, never thought that the tables could turn so quickly. The waiter's eyes scanned the room, briefly pausing on her at the back, and a small, knowing smile crossed his face. The soft music in the background seemed to fade, leaving only the tension in the air, sharp and electric. Every eye in the restaurant, from the wealthy Madus at the table to the staff quietly working around them, felt the weight of what was about to be said. And then, with a dramatic pause that seemed to stretch forever, the waiter opened his mouth again, the words about to fall like Lee. Here's a rewritten version of Scene 6 in simple, emotional, engaging, and detailed style. The waiter paused, letting the anticipation build, and then with a calm smile, he spoke words that cut through the room like lightning. "Tonight's entire dinner is being hosted by the new owner of this restaurant, Miss Chidinma Madu." For a moment, the music seemed to stop, the clinking of cutlery froze in midair, and even the chandelier's golden glow felt suspended. Silence swallowed the hall. Forks hovered above plates, glasses trembled slightly in people's hands, and the Madu family at the table froze as if someone had pressed a pause button on their lives. The relatives who had laughed at her just moments ago stared in disbelief, their mouths opening and closing without sound. Some eyes widened, some went narrow with shock, and some turned red with embarrassment. Chidinma's own heart raced, though her face remained calm. She could feel every gaze on her, burning and questioning, and yet she did not flinch. The girl they had mocked, the one they thought too simple, too humble, too small to belong at the table, was now standing at the center of their world in a way they had never imagined. Her simple wrapper, her neat geli, and her quiet composure suddenly carried a weight they could not ignore. Whispers began to ripple through the restaurant like a gentle storm at first. Chidinma? The owner? And then louder, spreading to every corner. Even some staff stopped mid-step, staring at her with newfound respect. The aunt who had sent her away felt her cheeks burn. A cousin nearly dropped a glass in shock. The pride they had displayed for so long crumbled in an instant, replaced by astonishment and a pang of guilt that stung sharper than any words. Chidinma remained seated at the back, her eyes calm but her presence commanding the room. The power of quiet dignity, patience, and resilience filled her like a tide, rising silently yet irresistibly. In that instant, here's a rewritten version of Scene 7 in simple, emotional, and engaging style. Forks clattered to plates, glasses wobbled, and a collective gasp echoed around the room. Eyes widened in shock, some hands flew to mouths, and the laughter that had filled the air moments ago vanished like smoke. The same relatives who had sneered at her, whispered behind her back, and treated her as if she were invisible now stared at her in disbelief. The poor girl they had dismissed, mocked, and thought too insignificant to sit at their table was, in fact, the owner of the very restaurant they sat in, the very place that had been a symbol of their wealth and status. Chidinma sat at the back, composed, her calm presence striking like a gentle storm. She felt the weight of every stare, every jaw dropped in astonishment, but she refused to rise just yet. Her eyes swept slowly across the table, meeting the shocked faces of the aunt who had insulted her, the cousins who had whispered cruel jokes, and the uncles who had barely glanced her way before. The disbelief on their faces was almost painful to watch, but in her heart, a quiet satisfaction bloomed. They had thought themselves superior, untouchable, and here she was, their assumptions shattered in a single announcement. Whispers filled the air, shaky and incredulous. "It can't be. Chidinma?" One cousin muttered, almost refusing to believe it. "She owns this place?" Another asked, voice trembling. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the occasional clink of a fork dropping to a plate, as if the room itself was gasping alongside them. Some of the relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly aware of their pride and cruelty, of the sneers and whispers that had seemed harmless before. And yet, Chidinma remained poised, her quiet dignity speaking louder than any words could. The irony of the moment hung in the air, thick and undeniable. The girl they had scorned had not just survived their judgments. Here's a rewritten version of Scene 8 in simple, emotional, and engaging style. The restaurant manager stepped forward, clearing his throat with a professional but excited tone. All eyes followed him, the room still thick with tension and disbelief. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I think it's time you all understand how tonight came to be." He paused for a moment, letting curiosity build. The Madu family leaned forward, some frowning, others still trying to mask embarrassment. "Miss Chidinma Madu," he continued, gesturing toward her at the back, "quietly inherited her late father's business. While many thought she had little, she worked tirelessly, day and night, to grow what she inherited. Today, she is the proud owner of not just this restaurant, but a chain of successful restaurants across Okirika." A murmur ran through the hall. Heads turned, jaws dropped, and the relatives who had mocked her moments ago exchanged nervous glances. Some couldn't believe their ears. The cousin who had whispered insults at her earlier looked pale, her hands trembling slightly. The aunt who had banished her from the table now stared at Chidinma, mouth barely able to form words. The manager smiled warmly, continuing, "She took what was quietly entrusted to her and built something extraordinary. Every detail in this restaurant, from the chandeliers above to the dishes on your plates, is the result of her vision and hard work. Tonight she chose to host this dinner not for herself, but for all of you, her family, and the people who matter." Chidinma remained seated, her posture graceful, her calm expression radiating a quiet power. The room could feel it, the respect she commanded without raising her voice, without demanding attention. She had turned years of judgment, whispers, and underestimation into strength, proving that dignity and patience could outshine pride and mockery. The relatives shifted uncomfortably, realizing the depth of their misjudgment. They had Here's a rewritten version of Scene 9 in simple, emotional, and engaging style. Slowly, deliberately, Chidinma rose from her seat at the back of the restaurant. The room seemed to hold its breath as she stood, her simple wrapper catching the soft glow of the chandeliers above. Her geli, neatly tied, now shimmered subtly, sparkling as the light danced across its folds. She lifted her head, her eyes steady and calm, and in that instant every ounce of doubt, every moment of shame, and every sneer directed at her felt powerless against the quiet strength she radiated. The Madhu family at the table could hardly recognize her, not because her appearance had changed, but because the energy around her had. Chidinma carried herself with the grace of someone who had endured, who had grown stronger through every insult and dismissal, and who now knew her worth. Each step she took toward the table was measured, full of quiet authority, yet without arrogance. The soft rustle of her wrapper sounded louder than any spoken word, echoing the confidence that had quietly built over years of hard work and patience. As she moved, the staff and other diners couldn't help but notice her presence. Heads turned, eyes widened, and whispers filled the air. Not of gossip but of awe. The girl they had once underestimated was now the queen of the night, commanding respect simply by being herself. Every glance she cast across the table seemed to hold a gentle, unspoken message. She had risen above their cruelty, above their pride, and above the narrow world they had confined her to. When she finally reached the center of the room, she paused, smiling softly. It wasn't a smile of triumph over others, but one of quiet fulfillment and dignity. The laughter, whispers, and mocking eyes of the past could no longer touch her. Tonight she owned more than a restaurant. She owned her story, her destiny, and the room itself. In that moment, every eye in the restaurant acknowledged it. Chidinma was. Here's a rewritten version of Scene 10 in simple, emotional, and engaging style. As Chidinma stood at the center of the room, calm and radiant, her family's voices began to tremble. A cousin, eyes wide and voice barely above a whisper, stepped forward and said, "Sister, forgive us. We didn't mean it." Another cousin added, stammering, You belong here more than anyone." Their words were hurried, shaky, and full of guilt, the pride they had carried for years suddenly crumbling like sand. The aunts and uncles shifted uncomfortably, some fidgeting in their seats, others lowering their heads, unable to meet her gaze. The aunt who had sent Chidinma away from the table looked pale, her lips pressed tightly together, the sharp edge of her previous sneer gone, replaced with regret that showed in the quick movement of her hands. Even the cousins who had whispered cruel jokes now avoided looking at her directly, their shame palpable in the air. Chidinma's lips curved into a soft, controlled smile, but she remained silent. Their sudden kindness, their apologies, and their frantic attempts to make amends did not move her. Not because she lacked compassion, but because their words came too late. She had waited patiently for her moment, for her life to show them what she was truly capable of, and this was not the time for her to answer them with words. Her silence spoke louder than any voice could. The room seemed to hold its breath as she simply looked at them, calm and dignified. Every eye on her could feel the quiet power she wielded, not through anger or revenge, but through composure and grace. They had tried to push her aside, to make her feel small, but now she stood taller than they ever had, and their words could not reach the strength she carried within. In that heavy, tense silence it became clear to everyone present, Chidinma was not moved by guilt or pleas. She was moved by her own life, her own patience, and the knowledge that she had risen above crew. Here's a rewritten version of Scene 11 in simple, emotional, and engaging style. Chidinma lifted her gaze, her eyes calm yet piercing, and let the room feel the weight of her presence. The whispers died instantly, and even the soft high-life music seemed to fade as every member of the Madhu family turned to her, waiting. She spoke, her voice steady and soft, yet carrying an authority that made every ear strain to listen. "You refused me a seat," she said, "because you thought I had nothing. Yet this table, these walls, this night belong to me." Her words hung in the air like a striking melody, echoing against the golden chandeliers and polished floors. The room went silent, no one daring to interrupt, no one daring to meet her eyes for too long. The pride and arrogance they had carried for years seemed suddenly small and fragile, shrinking beneath the calm power she radiated. Her family's laughter, the sneers, and the judgment, they all felt meaningless now, as though the universe itself had shifted and placed the truth plainly before them. Some cousins shuffled in their seats, hands pressed nervously to their laps, while others blinked rapidly, unable to believe what they were hearing. The aunt who had ordered her away from the table now looked on with shame, realizing the weight of every cruel word and gesture she had thrown at Chidinma. Even the uncles, who had thought themselves untouchable, looked down, their faces tight with embarrassment and awe. Chidinma paused, letting her words sink in fully. There was no anger in her tone, no bitterness, only quiet strength and undeniable truth. Every gesture, every fold of her wrapper, every subtle sparkle of her gelly reflected the woman she had become, composed, powerful and untouchable. The realization spread slowly through the room. The girl they had tried to diminish, the one they had mocked for her modesty, had not only survived their cruelty but had risen above it with elegance and grace. For a long moment. Here's a rewritten version of Scene 12 in simple, emotional, and engaging style. Chidinma looked around the room, her eyes calm and deliberate, and then she did something no one expected. Instead of walking over to the long family table, she gestured toward the waiters and staff who had been quietly serving the guests all evening. "Please," she said softly but firmly, "come and join me at my table." The staff froze for a moment, shocked and delighted, then hurried forward with smiles that could light up the entire restaurant. The chefs, the waiters, the cleaners, everyone who had worked tirelessly behind the scenes that evening now took their place beside her. The air seemed to change instantly. Music swelled, laughter erupted, and the warmth in the room multiplied as the staff shared stories, smiles, and quiet congratulations. The energy shifted from tension to joy, from shame to celebration. Meanwhile, the Madhu family sat frozen, their faces pale and expressions tight. They had expected Chidinma to beg, to cry, or even to stew in anger, but this calm grace, this act of generosity and inclusion, left them speechless. The aunt who had sent her away looked as if she had swallowed a bitter pill, while the cousins who had mocked her earlier shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Pride had no place here. It had been replaced by the quiet, undeniable truth of Chidinma's power and dignity. As laughter and chatter filled the hall, Chidinma smiled gently at her new table of friends and supporters. She raised her glass slightly, not in mockery, but in quiet triumph. The joy around her seemed to magnify her calm authority, highlighting that her strength did not come from revenge or punishment, but from kindness, patience, and wisdom. The family's shame was their own, and no words could undo it. In that moment it became clear to everyone watching. Chidinma had not only reclaimed her place, she had rewritten the rules. She had turned humiliation into celebration. Here's a rewritten version of Scene 13 in simple, emotional, and engaging style. The Madhu family sat at their long table stunned and silent. The laughter, whispers, and superiority they had carried for years seemed meaningless now. Every cousin, aunt, and uncle realized in that moment the full weight of their actions. They had mocked, insulted, and underestimated the very person who now stood above them in every possible way. Chidinma, the quiet, modest girl they had dismissed, was not just their equal tonight. She was far beyond them. Her calm dignity, her quiet strength, and the empire she had built made every ounce of their pride feel small and hollow. Some relatives slumped in their chairs, staring at the floor, unable to meet her eyes. The aunt who had scorned her now fiddled nervously with her napkin, wishing she could rewind the cruel words she had spoken. Cousins who had whispered behind her back now pressed their hands to their mouths, guilt etched deeply into their faces. The uncles who had carried themselves with authority and arrogance now sat frozen, realizing that money, status, and sharp tongues could never buy the respect, patience, and power Chidinma commanded effortlessly. The silence was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. The music, once lively, now seemed like a distant memory, drowned out by the realization of their folly. Even the staff, sitting proudly at Chidinma's table, looked on with quiet amusement, recognizing the poetic justice of the night. Every glance they cast toward the family carried the unspoken truth. You cannot mock someone who has built herself quietly, patiently, and with unwavering strength. Chidinma herself remained serene, her smile gentle but unshakable. She did not gloat, she did not taunt. Instead, she let the scene unfold naturally, letting the family feel the weight of their mistakes without a single word of reproach. The lesson was clear and undeniable. True power and dignity are earned, not inherited, and here's a rewritten version of Scene 14 in simple, emotional, and engaging style. Chidinma stood at the center of her table, calm, composed, and radiant. She did not shout, she did not boast, and she did not gloat. Yet, in her quiet presence, a lesson was delivered that no amount of words could match. Every glance she cast, every subtle movement of her hands, every gentle smile she offered spoke louder than any reprimand. Her calmness was a mirror, reflecting back to the Madu family the cruelty, pride, and judgment they had shown her for so many years. The family sat frozen, their faces pale, their pride crumbling like dust in the wind. They realized, with a sting that could not be softened, that her grace alone had become their punishment. They had thought humiliation could be inflicted with words and sneers, but true strength needed no voice to be felt. Chidinma had endured, had waited, and now her quiet dignity carried far more weight than any loud declaration ever could. Around her the staff laughed softly, toasted each other, and shared in the warmth of the evening. The music, once a backdrop, now felt alive, vibrant, and celebratory, echoing the triumph of patience, resilience, and hard-earned success. Chidinma's eyes swept across the room, not with anger, but with quiet awareness, letting everyone see that the power of composure and self-respect far outweighed pride, cruelty, and mockery. Even the youngest cousins, who had once whispered mean jokes, now sat wide-eyed, absorbing the lesson without a single word being spoken to them. The elders, too, shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the magnitude of their misjudgment and the elegance with which Chidinma had risen above it all. By the end of the night, it was clear to every person present, this was a moment of poetic justice. Chidinma's life, her choices, and her calm authority had rewritten the rules of respect, power, and dignity. Pride could not overpower patience. Cruelty could not overshadow St. Here's a rewritten version of Scene 15 in simple, emotional, and engaging style. By the next morning, the story of Chidinma Madu had spread across every corner of Okirika. Street vendors spoke of it between customers, shopkeepers whispered it to each other, and even the drivers waiting at traffic lights repeated the tale in hushed awe. Everyone talked about the young woman who had once been refused a seat at her own family's table, only to be revealed as the owner of the very restaurant where the dinner had taken place. The story carried itself like a spark, igniting conversations in markets, offices, and homes alike. People were amazed not just by her success, but by the way she had handled it, with calm, patience, and quiet dignity. Mothers told their children about the importance of respect, patience, and perseverance. Friends repeated it as a lesson on humility and grace. Even strangers who had never met Chidinma felt inspired, drawn to the tale of a woman who had been underestimated, mocked, and dismissed, and yet had risen above it all with elegance. In Okirika, her name became more than a name. It became a symbol of poetic justice, of destiny fulfilled, and of the power that comes from quiet strength and resilience. The lesson was clear. Life has a way of rewarding patience and humility, and the world always notices those who rise with grace. Chidinma's story was told over and over, leaving an imprint on everyone who heard it, a reminder that true power is not shown through arrogance or pride, but through the courage to endure, the wisdom to act with dignity, and the patience to let destiny unfold. Your full 15-scene outline is now fully expanded into engaging, emotional, cinematic storytelling totaling around 4,000 words, ready for dialogue polishing and viral scripting. If you want, I can also combine all 15 scenes into one flowing script with smooth transitions and dialogue, so it reads like a complete, ready-to-publish story. Do you want me to